All right, so attempts at peace between Arabs and Israelis, that's what we're going to talk about. And we just kind of went over the do now. So here we go. All right, I'll give you a second here. All right, so there have been, over a dozen attempts at establishing peace between the Arab world and Israel. But the two most notable are probably the Camp David Accords and what's called the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords are really two different agreements on kind of running on the backs of each other. So it's really kind of two things that we ball up into one. But in general, these are the two most notable attempts at peace between the two sides. So the Camp David Accord is something that is coordinated by U.S. President Jimmy Carter in a pretty forgettable presidency. This is probably Jimmy Carter's most important work, arguably. So he basically drags both sides to the table here. So this is peace agreement signed in 1978 between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. So contextualize, think of the year. We know the conflicts that have taken place over the course of the last 20 years, prior to 1978 or so, between the two sides. So, a lot of these Yom Kippur War, Suez War, 6-Day War, a lot of this stuff is still very fresh. So one of the chief combatants on the Arab side of a lot of those conflicts was Egypt. So it made sense to drag them to to as a representative for the kind of the Arab world in this peacemaking process. And the other side, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. So these guys will sign a peace deal, and it will have varying degrees of success. I don't want to kind of ruin the rest of the assignment here, but you will do some homework on that yourself. But in general, Jimmy Carter and Sadat and Begin are all going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. This is a conflict that the world has bore witness to for the better part of 15 or so years, and it's everyone is very aware of what's happening in this part of the world. So to establish some kind of peace here, as tenuous as it may be, is an incredible achievement nonetheless. The problem there is, okay, that's all well and good, but there's no representation from Palestine. Okay, this is Egypt and Israel. So, and Egypt kind of acting as, a figurehead kind of for the rest of the Arab world. But there's no input here. There's no process for the PLO and Palestine. So the Oslo Accords are agreements in 93 and 95 between Israel and their prime minister at that time is this guy Yitzhak Rabin, and the PLO leader Yasser Arafat, who we talked about yesterday. So this is another attempt, and this is trying to include, Palestine into this process. Now, the Camp David Accords dealt with the region of Israel and the Arab world kind of outside of that. It didn't really have anything to do with Palestine. So, we know what the complaints were and what the friction is, and a lot of it is about the fact that Israel is there, and Israel is kind of seizing more land as time goes on, and that creates conflict and things like that. But the real nuts and bolts of the problem here is the relationship between Israel and Palestine. So once you get the Oslo Accords, now you're starting to kind of establish a kind of agreement between the two chief kind of combatants. And the tricky part is, even if you make an agreement and the Palestine and Israel agree to peaceful terms with each other, does that change the way anybody really feels? Does that mean everyone goes to bed and wakes up the next day and they no longer feel like land has been stolen, on one side or the other? And the answer is probably no. But So it seems to me like what a lot of this is you're trying to, the world is trying to kind of deal with a lot of the symptoms and not really the underlying problem. And that's kind of, you know, difficult to overcome. So these are the important attempts at peace.